Welcome back to another Behind the Why short. If you've been looking at the news or anything lately, you realize there's a lot of craziness going on in this world, especially here in America. So today, I want to talk about the roots of some of the trouble we have. So join me again for another episode of Behind the Why shorts. All right, before we get started, take a moment and go ahead and hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, please. And we want you to join this conversation. Get your buddies, your pals, all to get involved. We want to talk about what's happening, guys, because unless we start talking, we're going to get bamboozled by the best of them. We need to figure this out. So hit that subscribe, like, and get involved with the conversation. Also hit that little bell so you know when we get another show drop, you'll be right on top of it. So let's talk about the roots of the civil rights movement. Because that's what this is all about. All this talk we see and marching through the streets and everybody yelling and screaming and burning down buildings and burning cop cars and shooting police officers as they're parked in their cars. Guys, let's talk about the root. When we think about the civil rights movement, you think about people like Dr. F.D. Reese and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. These guys started their work on their knees. They started in prayer. So when we look at what's going on around us today, do we see that same expression? Do we see people meeting in churches to pray? Do you see people seeking the face of God for the rights that God gave man, not the government? These unalienable rights given to us by our Creator. These people went to God in prayer and they sought Him on their knees. Yes, there were people outside. In this case, a real case of systemic racism where people were being brutalized. They were being tortured and even killed. We look at the historic march from Selma to Montgomery and how that all began. Again, beginning with Dr. F.D. Reese as he called in help, as he organized the teachers organization there, and they began to not only strike, but then to march and demand their rights, their civil rights to be voters in this country. And then as Dr. King and SNCC came in, again, another organization committed to nonviolence, these people came in and also went to the Lord in prayer. Now, does that mean that everybody involved was a Christian? No, not by any means. But what happened was the leadership directed its efforts through the cross. And then what we find is that slowly but surely, these changes began to happen. And then we see the march as it leaves Montgomery and goes into Selma. We see a lot of ugly stuff happen. The Klan dogged their trail. They abused some people. Some people were killed on the way back, as we know, some very famous situation where a young lady was killed who had come down from the north. Again, a white woman who had left her family to come down to work alongside blacks, and she was murdered by the Klan. But when we think about this, I was watching some episodes today, some footage, and I'm watching people march through the streets and they're saying, F Jesus, F your Jesus. F your Jesus. Just let your mind wrap around that. You who are Christians and you who are supporting these efforts in the street, you who called yourself a child of God and yet you're supporting what these people are doing in the streets. Think about that. F your Jesus. How do you come alongside of people who support that? And when I think about the whole thing with Biden and Harris coming out and they are supporting these riots and all that goes, of course, they have softened their position a little bit since they got called out on it. But the whole time they've been supporting this. And yet we as Christians, if we are aligning ourselves with these people, what must that say about us? I mean, as a child, I've gone to war for people saying the wrong thing about my mama. You think about that. And yet here we are as believers. And people can march through the streets saying, F your Jesus, and yet Christians still line up behind them. Is it not bad enough that we have an entire party committed to the murder of children, the absolute destruction of children in the womb, and yet we as Christians line up behind it? And I've heard the arguments. Christians will say something like, well, it's just like any other sin. And you're like, no, it's not. It's not just like any other sin. This is a helpless child being murdered in its mother's womb. So it's not like any other sin. Gluttony is a sin, but you know what? It doesn't kill anybody. It doesn't kill an innocent person. At least the person who's a glutton is punishing themselves with sin. This case, this is a child in his mother's womb. Yet we have a party who's committed to the death and destruction of its children. I was looking at the stats and it was so overwhelming to me, guys. It brought me up short. I looked at the national stats of abortions by state and I was amazed. And how many thousands, and I mean, you hear these big numbers, right? You hear these numbers, but all of a sudden when you see the figures in front of you, that how many thousands of children are being killed in state after state after state. And why? For the convenience of living? Oh, we give all these thoughts of a woman's right to choose. I'm like, yeah, they said the same thing about slavery, right? It's the person's right to choose whether or not they have slaves. And that sounds all fine and dandy unless you're the slave. It's all good when you're not the one that's being punished. You can have all these theoretical discussions about what the legitimacy is of slavery or even of abortion. But the babies that are being sucked out of their mother's womb, dismembered in their mother's womb, those little babies don't get a choice. And yet the church is still standing by silent. We've talked about it time and time again, guys. We're in a moral war in this country. We're in moral debate. It's an ideological war. And what you have to ask yourself is, what is your worldview? Now, some of you may not know what I mean by that when I ask the question, your worldview. What is a worldview? Well, the worldview is your set of beliefs that determine how you see the world. It's really that simple. So we talked about in a show previously that culture is normative. So if you live in a culture, let's say you live in a culture where you live in a street gang, there are certain things that you do that are normal, that other people look at and they go, well, that's just bad, that's wrong, that's weird. If you're in prison and you see there's behaviors that happen in prison that people go, well, that's weird. But in prison, those behaviors become normalized, not normal, but normalized because of the culture you live in. So as a Christian in America, you have to ask yourself, what is being normalized for you? Are you able to sit here as a child of God and honestly say that you think the God of heaven favors one ethnic group over another? Are you as a child of God able to say that you really believe that the God of heaven, the God who said, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son, that God's going to look at one ethnic group and say, oh yeah, put down this other group while you elevate another one? No, I think not. So think back to the roots of the civil rights movement when it talked about equality and justice for every man. Not just for certain groups of men, not just for certain groups of people. And now we have this mantra that's been passed around on the streets in the different marches where they're talking about, give us your stuff. Give us your stuff or we're going to burn it down. Give us your stuff. Oh, what is that? That is fascism at its best, guys. Where if you don't do what we tell you, we will destroy you. Now, here's an example from relatively recent history. Circa 1929 going into the 30s, Germany. You heard me talk about this before. Hitler had the brown shirts. And what did they do? Well, they dressed up in their brown shirts. And when they found people who disagreed with them politically, they would attack them. They would beat them, sometimes destroy their businesses, until people were so afraid that they did not stand out against them. Go down to Italy, same era. Mussolini, the Blackshirts. They did the exact same thing. When people disagreed with them, they began to attack them, burn their properties, intimidate them, cause them to be afraid to stand up for what's right. And now we come to America, 2020. Gosh, I was watching with my daughter the other day this episode of Voyager, and it was called The Year from Hell. And if you've ever seen the Voyager episode, what happens is they get caught in a time loop where everything you could think possibly goes wrong. To eventually Captain Janeway's on a ship with her crew and people have been killed, the ship has been destroyed, and she's down to just the command deck, not even the full command deck, it's about 5 people. And she puts those off on other ships and they go and they fight this alien called the Kremen. Well, the very last stroke of the day, Janeway decides she's gonna commit suicide in order to save everybody. She does this with the hope that if she destroys the ship that has the time warp machine on, that everything will be restored. Well, that's what we kind of feel about 2020. Sometimes I wish we could just hit the time warp, destroy this thing, blow it up and start all over again. Because man, I'm telling you, what a year. It started off great. I was on vacation. I was seeing the Big Apple. I actually was in Christmas in New York for Christmas and New Year's. What an experience. And then February happened. My wife got sick. We came home and then the world got sick. And then we came home again, and the world continued to get sick. It just started blowing up. And then people started going crazy, lost their ever-loving mind. What happened? We forgot about truth. So unlike those civil rights workers in the 1960s and 70s who sought to get on their knees before God of heaven and ask for guidance and help, and they had a standard of truth and righteousness, that even though everybody did not call themselves Christians or identify as Christians, there was a standard of righteousness that they could hold to. And guess what? It was the same standard that the Constitution was built on. So when Dr. King and other people like Dr. Reese stood up and talked to the powers that be, when the sheriff was, I want to say Cotton Nichols, but I might be getting him confused. No, Bull Connor was in Birmingham, so Cotton Nichols was there in Selma, telling them that they couldn't come to the courthouse. They could look back in their face and say emphatically, this is our courthouse too. Why? Because the Constitution had said so. So when you look at what's going on around today, guys, you look at what happened, what really brought the changes in this country, it was men of prayer. It was women of prayer. People like the courageous Aid of Selma, who had a standard of righteousness and held on to it. It was people like Dr. King, who did not shrink back, even though their lives were being threatened. It was people like Dr. Reese, who lived his entire life in the little town of Selma, a national and international icon of civil rights movement, but never left his hometown. Why? Because the fight never ended. He continued to fight for righteousness. So when you look around, guys, and you see all these people telling you to burn and telling you to ignore your Christian roots, do yourself a favor. Take a moment and get behind the why. So why are people telling me to ignore what I know to be truth just so that I can go help them reach their goals? Don't be a sucker. Take a moment to find out what's behind the why. So until next time, may the real God of heaven, the true God of heaven, bless and keep you. Catch you next time. Peace.